Christmas gatherings at my in-laws' residence have always possessed a peculiar quality that I struggled to articulate for years. The atmosphere carries an artificial brightness, an overly cheerful veneer stretched thin across underlying tensions that everyone silently agrees to ignore. It resembles a carefully constructed stage set where every family member plays their assigned role, terrified that one misstep might cause the entire facade to crumble spectacularly. The lights shine too brightly, the decorations appear too perfect, and the forced joviality feels wound so tightly that you can practically hear it humming with suppressed strain. This particular Christmas evening began like all the others before it. We arrived with our daughters, 8-year-old Ella and 11-year-old Hannah, carrying the obligatory dishes and wearing the expected smiles. My husband Eric walked beside me with that familiar tension in his shoulders, the kind that appears exclusively when we approach his mother's home. I had learned over the years to recognize this physical manifestation of his anxiety, this unconscious bracing for whatever emotional landmine might detonate during our visit. Ella, my youngest daughter, stayed close to my side as we entered the house. She clutched something precious in her small hands, holding it carefully against her chest as though it were made of spun glass and dreams. For the entire week leading up to this gathering, she'd been bubbling with barely contained excitement about this particular moment. She had won her school spelling bee, earning a certificate of achievement that represented hours of dedicated study, countless practice sessions, and genuine academic accomplishment. In her 8-year-old heart, sharing this triumph with her grandmother first felt like the most natural thing in the world. I watched as Ella gathered her courage, her small fingers gripping the edges of that certificate so tightly that the paper began to curl slightly at the corners. Her cheeks flushed pink, not from the winter cold we had just escaped, but from the pure, unfiltered excitement that only children can experience when they are bursting to share something they are genuinely proud of achieving. She had been planning this moment, rehearsing it in her mind, imagining her grandmother's reaction with all the hopeful innocence that children possess before the world teaches them that not all adults deserve their trust. "Grandma," Ella said, her voice small, but filled with bright anticipation as she stepped forward. "I wanted to show you this first." My mother-in-law, Diane, accepted the certificate from Ella's outstretched hands, with the kind of deliberate slowness that immediately set my internal alarm bells ringing. She held the paper between two fingers as though my daughter had handed her something distasteful, something she found vaguely offensive merely by its existence. Her facial expression remained carefully neutral at first, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts were churning behind her eyes. She drew in one slow, measured breath through her nose, then released it through her mouth in a calculated exhale that seemed designed to communicate displeasure without words. Then her lips compressed into that razor-thin line that I had learned to recognize over years of careful observation. This particular expression meant that Diane had decided someone needed to be cut down to size, and she was about to engage in that task with the kind of surgical precision that only comes from extensive practice. "You think you can buy my love with that?" Diane's words dropped into the festive atmosphere like stones shattering glass. Ella blinked, her young mind clearly struggling to process what she had just heard. The confusion in her eyes was painful to witness. I blinked as well, my own brain refusing to immediately accept what was unfolding. Around us, the entire room seemed to collectively blink, as though reality itself had momentarily glitched and everyone needed a moment to recalibrate their understanding of what was actually happening. What came next occurred with a terrible, dreamlike slowness that seared itself into my memory with perfect clarity. Diane tore Ella's spelling bee certificate cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence with shocking clarity. But she did not stop there. She tore it in half again, then again and again. Each tear was deliberate, methodical, performed with the careful precision of someone who wanted to ensure complete destruction. She might have been folding origami, so focused and intentional were her movements, except instead of creating something beautiful, she was systematically demolishing my daughter's confidence one rip at a time. When she had reduced the certificate to small, meaningless scraps, Diane dropped them directly into the trash can positioned beside her chair. She did not even glance at where they fell. The gesture carried an air of profound boredom, as though this entire interaction had been tedious and she was simply disposing of something that had wasted her valuable time. The casualness of this final act somehow made the entire scene even more devastating. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It detonated through the room like a shockwave, hitting every person present with palpable force. I felt it reverberate through my teeth, vibrate through my spine, settle at the base of my skull where it pounded with the rhythm of my suddenly racing heart. This was not the comfortable quiet of contentment or the peaceful silence of reflection. This was the loaded, dangerous quiet that precedes explosions, the held breath before catastrophe. Ella stood frozen, staring at the trash can as though she could not quite comprehend what she had just witnessed. For one suspended moment, she looked simply confused, her young mind clearly struggling to reconcile what had just occurred with her expectations of how grandmothers should behave. Then understanding crashed over her in a visible wave. Her small face seemed to fold inward on itself, her mouth began to tremble, and her eyes went shiny with the telltale glassiness of tears that she was desperately, stubbornly trying not to shed in front of this audience. Children possess a particular kind of pride that makes them blink rapidly and bite their lips when they feel the hot pressure of tears building, trying so hard not to cry publicly because crying feels like admitting defeat. The entire room remained frozen in this tableau of dysfunction, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt infinitely worse. It was the quiet complicity of people who had collectively decided to pretend that nothing awful had just occurred, that a grown woman had not just deliberately and cruelly humiliated a child for the crime of being proud of her own achievement. I forced myself to look around the room, cataloging each person's reaction with a kind of detached horror. My sister-in-law Melissa sat in her chair, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress with careful, satisfied movements. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, an expression of something almost like vindication, as though this outcome was precisely what she had been hoping to witness. She did not look surprised. She looked pleased. Bella, Melissa's daughter and Diane's unequivocally favorite grandchild, watched the entire scene unfold with bright, curious eyes. There was something almost pleased in her expression as well, a subtle satisfaction that suggested she understood exactly what had just happened and approved of the family hierarchy being so clearly reinforced. At 10 years old, Bella had already learned that her position in this family dynamic depended on ensuring that no other child outshone her in Diane's eyes. Raymond, my father-in-law, stared fixedly at his hands as though they had suddenly become the most fascinating objects in the universe. His entire body seemed to contract inward, shoulders hunching, spine curving as he appeared to actively attempt to disappear into the upholstery of his chair. This was not the first time he had witnessed his wife's cruelty, and his response had clearly been perfected over decades of practiced avoidance. He had long ago made peace with being a passive observer rather than an active participant in his own family's dysfunction. Eric, my husband, stood rigid beside me. All color had drained from his face, leaving him pale and stunned, looking like someone had struck him unexpectedly. He was completely frozen, every muscle locked in place as though moving might shatter whatever fragile control he was maintaining over himself. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes wide and fixed on the scene before him, but he did not speak. He did not move. He did not defend his daughter. Not one adult in that room stepped forward to intervene. Not one person asked Ella if she was okay, offered her comfort, or acknowledged that something deeply wrong had just occurred. The silence stretched and expanded, growing thick and shameful, filling every corner of the space with the weight of collective moral failure. And then my oldest daughter moved, and everything changed. The sound of Hannah's chair scraping sharply backward sliced through the oppressive silence like a knife cutting through fabric. My 11-year-old daughter stood up with deliberate slowness, her small shoulders pulled back tight, her spine straight with purpose. Her eyes burned with an emotion I had rarely seen in someone so young, a righteous fury that blazed clear and focused despite the trembling that ran through her small frame. She walked directly to Ella with measured, purposeful steps and positioned herself physically between her younger sister and that trash can, her body language making an unmistakable statement about protection and allegiance. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with barely controlled emotion, but every word carried clearly through the silent room. "Why would you do that?" Hannah asked, her voice rising slightly with each word. "She's 8. Good grandmas don't do that." The simplicity of her statement made it devastating. There was no sophisticated argument, no complex reasoning, just the pure or uncomplicated moral clarity that children possess before the world teaches them to accept unacceptable behavior for the sake of keeping peace. Diane's eyes went wide with genuine shock. Her expression suggested that she truly could not comprehend the reality of being confronted by a child, of having her behavior challenged by someone she considered beneath her in the family hierarchy. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again as she struggled to formulate a response to this unprecedented rebellion. "How dare you?" Diane finally snapped, her voice sharp with indignation and disbelief. Hannah did not flinch. She did not retreat even a single step. She did not drop her gaze or apologize or demonstrate any of the submissive behaviors that Diane clearly expected. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly higher and spoke again with that same trembling conviction. "How dare you?" Hannah replied, her voice cracking slightly but never wavering in its intensity. "You hurt my sister." The impact of this exchange rippled through the room like an aftershock. I heard someone gasp softly, that involuntary intake of breath that signals profound shock. I saw heads turn, eyes widen, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they were forced to acknowledge what their silence had tacitly endorsed. Even the Christmas tree lights seemed to dim slightly, as though the universe itself was responding to the dramatic shift in the room's energy. My husband remained completely frozen beside me, still locked in whatever internal paralysis had gripped him from the moment his mother had torn up Ella's certificate. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes locked on the scene, playing out before us as though he were watching something happen behind glass, separated from the action by an invisible barrier he could not cross. He did not move to support his daughter. He did not speak to defend her. He did not even appear to be breathing. And perhaps that was the precise moment when something inside me quietly shattered, beyond any possibility of repair. I watched Diane carefully, studying her face as she muttered just loud enough for everyone present to hear, "Kids today are too full of themselves." She delivered this pronouncement as though it were a self-evident truth, as though she had not just emotionally brutalized an 8-year-old child whose only crime had been academic achievement and a desire to share that achievement with her grandmother. There was no apology in her tone, no hesitation, no recognition that her behavior might have been inappropriate. There was nothing but that familiar expression of superior disdain, that particular squint that communicated her absolute certainty that she occupied the moral high ground in this situation. That was the moment I reached my breaking point, the precise instant when something fundamental shifted inside me, and I understood with perfect clarity that we had arrived at a point of no return. "We're leaving," I announced. My voice emerged cold and flat, completely devoid of emotion or negotiation. It did not shake with anger or rise with hysteria. It simply stated a fact, delivered a verdict that was already final and absolute. There would be no discussion, no debate, no attempts at reconciliation or explanation. Hannah immediately reached for Ella's hand, her fingers closing around her sister's with fierce protectiveness that made my chest physically ache. Ella clung to Hannah in return, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking just slightly with the tears she was still desperately trying not to shed in front of these people who had proven themselves unworthy of her vulnerability. We gathered our coats in absolute ringing silence. Not one person attempted to stop us. Not one person tried to explain or apologize or offer any form of comfort to my traumatized child. They simply sat there, like elaborately dressed mannequins, their eyes darting around the room to look anywhere except at us, guilt simmering beneath their carefully maintained neutral expressions, but their mouths remained firmly shut. And perhaps that collective silence was actually the worst part of the entire evening. Not just Diane's deliberate cruelty, but the fact that every adult in that room watched a child get crushed and actively decided to do absolutely nothing. They chose complicity. They chose comfort over courage. They chose to protect a toxic family dynamic rather than protect an innocent child. We stepped out onto the porch together, and the winter air hit my face with sharp, clean intensity, like a physical slap that jolted me back into reality after being submerged in the suffocating atmosphere inside. Behind us, the house continued to glow warm and bright through its windows, looking for all the world like a perfect festive scene, a pretty little snow globe full of people and things that were pretending not to be fundamentally broken. I pulled the door closed behind us slowly and deliberately, like I was sealing off a crime scene or closing a chapter of our lives that could never be reopened. The soft click of the latch settling into place sounded unnaturally loud in the cold night air. As that sound faded, one truth settled deep into my bones with absolute certainty. This was not a random incident. This was not a sudden explosion of temper or a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a calm conversation. This was the inevitable culmination of years of dysfunction, the moment when all the carefully hidden toxicity finally erupted into plain view, where it could no longer be ignored or explained away. And something in my gut told me that the real explosion was still coming. That what we had just experienced was merely the opening act of a much larger reckoning that would force everyone in this family to finally choose sides and face consequences. If someone had asked me 5 years earlier whether my mother-in-law would ever deliberately destroy one of my children's academic certificates, I probably would have laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion and said something naively optimistic like, "No way, she's just a little intense sometimes." The truth is that intense was merely the warm-up act, the preview of coming attractions, the warning sign I repeatedly chose to ignore because acknowledging the pattern would have required taking action I was not yet prepared to take. What happened on Christmas was not random or unprecedented. It was the grand finale of a carefully choreographed routine that Diane had been perfecting for years. A performance I had been watching unfold while desperately trying not to see it for what it actually was. Let me take you back to the beginning and show you how the foundation for this explosion was laid brick by careful brick. When I first met Eric during our college years, I knew 2 essential things about him almost immediately. First, he was kind in a way that felt genuinely rare and precious, the sort of thoughtful consideration that could not be faked or performed. He noticed small details about people's comfort and went out of his way to accommodate needs they had not even articulated yet. Second, and I should have paid more attention to this particular detail, he apologized constantly for things that required no apology whatsoever. He would say, "I'm sorry," for standing too close to a piece of furniture, for breathing in a way that might have been audible, for existing in a space where he might potentially inconvenience someone. At the time, I found this excessive politeness endearing, perhaps even charming in its earnestness. I should have connected the dots sooner and recognized this behavior for what it actually was, the learned response of someone who had been trained from childhood to believe that his very existence was an imposition that required constant apology. The first genuine red flag appeared long before we had children, during a casual family dinner where I happened to mention finishing at the top of my class in college. It was not stated as a brag, merely mentioned in passing during a conversation about our academic experiences. Diane's reaction to this information was so profoundly flat that you could have used her facial expression as a level tool for construction purposes. "Oh," she said, her tone carefully neutral in a way that somehow communicated volumes of judgment. One of those high-achieving types. She did not say it with obvious sarcasm or mean-spirited mockery. The delivery was perfectly polite on the surface, but the subtle implication was unmistakable. Academic success was somehow a character flaw, a sign of moral deficiency, evidence of being too much, or showing off or violating some unspoken rule about acceptable levels of achievement. At the time, I shrugged off this strange reaction and told myself that people were entitled to hold unconventional opinions. I made excuses for her and convinced myself that I was being overly sensitive or reading too much into an innocent comment. Then Bella was born, and suddenly Diane transformed into a walking parade float of pride and praise, a fountain of endless enthusiasm for every single thing her favorite grandchild touched or attempted. Anything Bella produced immediately became miraculous in Diane's eyes. A wobbly crayon drawing that barely resembled anything identifiable would prompt gasps of artistic genius. A half-finished school worksheet with several wrong answers would elicit praise for brilliant effort and natural intelligence. A participation ribbon earned simply for showing up would become grounds for declarations that everyone present should feel jealous of Bella's exceptional qualities. I want to state clearly and emphatically that Bella herself is not a bad child. This entire situation is not her fault, and I harbor no resentment toward her personally. She is sweet in her own way, possessing kindnesses and qualities that have nothing to do with academics. School has simply never been her strongest area, and she does not possess a naturally academic inclination. That is perfectly fine and acceptable. Not every child needs to be a spelling champion or find joy in scholarly pursuits. Different people have different strengths, and Bella's strengths simply lie in other areas. However, the problem was never Bella's actual abilities or achievements. The problem was that Bella became Diane's everything, the perfect little princess who existed in Diane's mind as someone who required constant protection from anything and anyone who might make her feel like she was not the absolute best at everything always. Then Ella arrived in our family, and the dynamic shifted in ways I initially tried very hard not to notice or acknowledge. Ella genuinely loves learning in a way that appears completely natural and effortless for her. She reads books voluntarily for pure enjoyment, rather than because they are assigned. She remembers information she reads or hears as though she was born with a sophisticated filing system installed in her brain. Academic pursuits bring her joy, and she approaches school with enthusiasm rather than obligation. Consequently, Ella began bringing home real, meaningful achievements: spelling certificates, reading awards, commendations from teachers who noted that she was performing exceptionally well. These were not participation trophies or awards for simply showing up. These were recognitions of genuine effort and accomplishment. And every single time Ella succeeded at something, Diane's face performed this peculiar little twitch that I learned to recognize and dread. Her expression would tighten almost imperceptibly. She would force out a smile so stiff it looked painful. She would offer a brief, curt nod. Then she would quickly change the subject, redirecting conversation away from Ella's achievement as though it were somehow inappropriate or uncomfortable to acknowledge. It was as though Diane literally could not digest or process the fact that someone other than Bella had done something noteworthy, as though there existed in her mind only a limited amount of acknowledgement available, and Ella's achievements were somehow stealing from Bella's rightful share. Meanwhile, when Bella brought anything to show her grandmother, literally anything at all, regardless of its significance or quality, Diane would react as though someone had presented her with a Nobel Prize or announced that Bella had been chosen to represent humanity in communications with extraterrestrial life. At first, I worked very hard to explain away this obvious disparity. I told myself comforting lies. Oh, she's just excited to be a grandmother. Oh, she just expresses affection differently for different children. Oh, maybe she's tired or distracted right now. I constructed elaborate justifications for behavior that should not have required justification. But Hannah, my observant, perceptive, quiet Hannah, saw through every excuse and rationalization instantly. Even as a young child, she possessed an almost unsettling ability to read unspoken dynamics and understand adult behavior in ways that children should not have to understand. Grandma only likes when we show her stuff if it's small, Hannah told me, matter-of-factly one afternoon after a family visit. If it's something good, she gets weird. I remember staring at my daughter after she said this, opening my mouth to argue or correct her perception, then closing it again because I could not formulate a defense that was not obviously a lie. She was absolutely right, and we both knew it. The moment when all my half-formed suspicions finally crystallized into undeniable clarity came a few months before the Christmas incident. Ella had just won a class award, not a huge competition with international prestige, just a legitimate recognition of genuine accomplishment she had worked hard to achieve. She brought it to show Diane during a family visit, practically glowing with pride and excitement. Diane glanced at the award with that same tight expression, forced the smallest possible smile, and then pulled me aside later into a private conversation that I will never forget. "You should tell her not to go around flaunting these things," Diane said, her tone carrying clear disapproval. "It can hurt other kids' feelings." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "What other kids?" I asked. Diane's eyes flicked directly toward Bella, then back to meet mine with pointed intensity. "I mean any child who doesn't have it as easy as she does," she snapped, suddenly irritated that I was not immediately understanding and agreeing with her position. And there it was, finally. The truth she had been dancing around for years, stated plainly enough that I could no longer pretend I did not understand. Diane interpreted Ella's achievements as deliberate attacks on Bella's self-esteem, not as bragging or arrogance or inappropriate pride, but simply as existing, simply being naturally good at academic pursuits, simply outshining Bella by accident of ability and inclination. From that point forward, everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The pattern that I had been trying so hard not to see became impossible to ignore. When Bella had a small moment of accomplishment and Ella had a larger one, Diane would become cold and withdrawn. When Ella brought home something impressive, Diane would dismiss it as showing off or attention-seeking behavior. When Bella managed to achieve something relatively minor, Diane would react as though she had earned a full scholarship to Harvard or discovered a cure for a major disease. This was not about teaching humility or instilling good values. This was not about protecting sensitive feelings or promoting kindness. This was about maintaining a rigid hierarchy in which Bella must always remain on top and Ella must always remain beneath her, regardless of their actual abilities, efforts, or achievements. Hannah recognized this truth long before Ella understood what was happening. At some point that I cannot precisely identify, Hannah quietly stopped showing Diane any of her own school achievements. She simply stopped mentioning them, stopped bringing them to family gatherings, stopped seeking any acknowledgement from that side of the family. She doesn't like it, Hannah explained simply when I finally asked why. She's nicer when I pretend I didn't do anything. That single sentence broke something inside me. My 11-year-old daughter had learned that the safest path was to hide her light, to diminish herself, to pretend to be less than she was in order to avoid punishment for the crime of being competent. The favoritism and the emotional manipulation existed within a larger context that I need to explain for the full picture to make sense. Eric had been helping Diane and Melissa financially for years, quietly transferring money on a regular basis, driven by guilt that had been carefully cultivated since his childhood. It started reasonably enough with what was presented as a temporary loan during a difficult period. Then it expanded to covering a bill here, funding a repair there, and eventually evolved into regular monthly transfers that Diane treated as a salary she had earned simply by virtue of being Eric's mother and having struggled at various points in her life. Whenever I questioned these ongoing financial transfers, Eric would fold inward emotionally and retreat into justifications that had clearly been programmed into him long ago. "She raised us," he would say, his voice carrying that familiar defeated tone. "She struggled and sacrificed. She needs help." And perhaps she did genuinely need help at certain points. I am not suggesting that children should never assist parents who are struggling. But it did not take very long for me to notice that Diane talked about compassion and family obligation, as though it were a one-way street with traffic flowing exclusively in her direction. The more financially stable our household became through our own work and planning, the more Diane seemed to look at Ella's achievements not as something to celebrate, but as something to resent. It was as though our success made her feel diminished, and Ella's academic recognition served as a visible reminder of a life trajectory that diverged from what Diane had envisioned or approved. She was not protecting Bella's feelings or teaching important lessons about humility. She was protecting her own psychological narrative in which she remained the central figure who deserved endless support and accommodation, while simultaneously maintaining complete control over which family members were permitted to shine and which were required to dim their light. So when Ella stepped forward on Christmas evening, thrilled and hopeful and proud, holding out that spelling bee certificate with both hands and all her heart, Diane did not see a beloved grandchild trying to share a special moment of personal triumph. She saw a threat to her carefully maintained family hierarchy. She saw a challenge to her authority. She saw someone refusing to stay in their assigned position. And she did what she had always done when she felt threatened or when someone refused to play their designated role. She cut the problem down to size, literally and figuratively. Christmas was just the moment when she finally stopped hiding her cruelty behind plausible deniability and polite euphemisms. It was the moment when the mask slipped completely off and everyone in that room was forced to see what had always been there. Because the truth was that we had been standing on an emotional landmine for years. The entire family had been tiptoeing around this explosive dysfunction, pretending everything was fine, making excuses, keeping peace at any cost. Diane had simply finally stepped on that landmine hard enough for it to detonate spectacularly. And none of us had any idea how much bigger that explosion was going to get, or how much more damage would be revealed once the smoke finally cleared. By the time we arrived home from what I had already mentally labeled as Diane's Christmas circus of cruelty, I thought I had finished feeling anything at all. I believed I had reached some kind of emotional plateau where nothing else could possibly hurt or shock or devastate me any further. I was profoundly wrong. Ella walked directly to the couch without saying a single word, moving like someone in a daze. She still clutched the torn pieces of her spelling bee certificate in her small hands, holding those scraps as though they were fragments of her heart that she could not quite bring herself to release. Hannah sat down immediately beside her younger sister, wrapping one protective arm around Ella's shoulders, her eyes fixed on the floor with an expression far too old and weary for an 11-year-old child to wear. She looked like a bodyguard who had just realized that the person she was trying to protect needed defense from their own family, from people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. "I'll put on a movie," I heard myself say, because apparently my brain had switched into emergency autopilot mode, reaching for the familiar comfort routines that parents deploy during crises. "Something cozy, okay?" Ella nodded without looking up, without speaking, without displaying any of the usual enthusiasm she would normally show for movie time. Hannah gave me one of those brief, tight glances that communicated entire volumes. I see everything that just happened, and I am trying desperately not to cry in front of her, because she needs me to be strong right now. I turned on some brightly animated film that none of us were actually going to watch or pay attention to, then walked into the kitchen on legs that felt like they had been hastily installed by an incompetent mechanic using substandard materials. My hands trembled visibly as I reached for the cocoa mix in the cabinet, intending to make hot chocolate because that felt like the sort of thing a functional mother should do after her child has been emotionally devastated. The shaking in my hands was not simply nerves or stress. It was rage, thick and hot and crawling up my spine like liquid fire, threatening to consume everything in its path. I poured milk into a pot and set it on the stove, turning on the burner. The second I heard the small click of ignition behind me, I sensed Eric's presence in the doorway. I could feel him standing there before I even turned around, could sense his hesitation and the weight of whatever he was about to say. "Megan," he started, his voice soft and tentative. That single word, my name spoken in that particular apologetic tone, was the spark that ignited everything I had been holding back. "She tore up her spelling bee certificate," I snapped, spinning around to face him with all the fury I had been suppressing since we left his mother's house. "In front of everyone. She humiliated her." My voice emerged sharper and louder than I had intended, but I did not care even slightly. Someone needed to say these words out loud. Someone needed to actually look directly at what had happened instead of shoving it into the mental drawer labeled Diane being Diane, where apparently every horrible thing she did was filed away and forgotten. Eric physically flinched as though I had thrown something at his head. His face had gone pale, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I know," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, Megan. You just what?" I demanded, cutting him off before he could finish whatever excuse or explanation he was formulating. "You just stood there and watched her tear it up like it was garbage? Ella looked at you. I looked at you, and you did absolutely nothing." His shoulders sagged under the weight of this accusation. He moved slowly toward one of the kitchen chairs and sank into it as though his knees had simply given out, as though he no longer possessed the strength to remain standing. I froze. He whispered, staring down at his hands rather than meeting my eyes, like I always freeze. The worst part was that he was not being dramatic or exaggerating for effect. He meant it literally. This was a pattern he recognized in himself, a learned helplessness that had been trained into him over decades. He put his elbows on the table and rubbed both hands over his face in a gesture of profound exhaustion and defeat. When he finally looked up again, something behind his eyes had cracked open, some sealed chamber of memory and pain that he had apparently kept locked away for years. "She used to do the same thing to me," he said quietly. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, the wooden spoon I had been holding completely forgotten in my hand. Behind me, the cocoa was starting to bubble too rapidly, but I could not bring myself to care about it. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already knew. I needed him to say it out loud. I needed him to hear himself articulate this truth that he had apparently been carrying alone. Eric gave a bitter, humorless half-laugh that sounded more like a wounded sound than anything resembling amusement. "You know how she always tells everyone that I was so smart growing up?" he began. "Funny how she always leaves out the part where she absolutely hated it." Then he started talking faster, as though someone had opened a valve that had been sealed under pressure for too long. The words poured out of him in a rush. Anytime I used a word she considered too sophisticated, she would say, "Don't try to sound smarter than other people. You're showing off." If I came home excited about a good grade, she would tell me to stop bragging and that I was going to make my sister feel inadequate. I brought home an academic award once, just a small recognition from school, nothing major. She actually rolled her eyes at me and told me to put it away before company arrived so that I would not look like I was showing off. My throat tightened painfully as I listened to him describe a childhood that suddenly made his adult behavior make horrible sense. "I thought it was discipline," Eric continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I genuinely believed she was keeping me grounded and teaching me humility. I spent my entire childhood thinking that I was fundamentally flawed for being proud of my own achievements, that there was something wrong with me for wanting acknowledgement." He stared down at his hands, turning them over as though seeing them for the first time. But tonight, when she did it to Ella. His voice trailed off for a moment before he could continue. It was like watching my own childhood get replayed in front of me, except this time it was not happening to me. It was happening to my kid, and I froze exactly the same way my father always froze when I needed him to protect me. Something shifted in his expression then. The guilt was still clearly visible, but underneath it, anger had begun to surface. Not explosive rage, but something colder and more determined. He stood up so abruptly that his chair jolted backward with a sharp scraping sound. "I'm done," he said firmly, more conviction in his voice than I had heard in years. "I am not letting her do this again, not to them." Before I could ask what done actually meant in practical terms, Eric was already moving. He walked out of the kitchen with purpose, heading down the hallway toward the small office we barely used except for dealing with taxes and occasionally stressing about bills. I turned off the burner under the now scalding cocoa and followed him, my heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and hope that I was afraid to fully acknowledge. By the time I reached the office doorway, Eric had already settled at his desk, with his laptop open in front of him, his fingers flying across the keyboard with focused intensity. On the screen, I could see his bank account interface, rows of transaction history spreading across the display. One name showed up repeatedly in that list, appearing over and over with depressing regularity. Transfers to Diane, payments sent to Melissa, money designated to cover emergencies, or help until things settle. All those times he had said, "She just needs a little help right now." All those times I had let it slide because I did not want to be the villain who denied assistance to struggling family members. "I've been paying her to treat our kids like they're beneath her," Eric said quietly, his voice tight with controlled fury and self-directed disgust. "I've been financially supporting someone who just destroyed our daughter's achievement for sport." He clicked on a recurring payment labeled something generic like Mom Utilities, Cancel, Confirm. Another payment appeared, this one marked Mom Credit Card. Cancel, confirm. "Eric," I whispered, my heart performing complicated gymnastics in my chest. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this right now?" He did not even look away from the screen. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said firmly. "If she thinks she owns me because I send her money, if she believes that financial support gives her the right to hurt my children, then she's fundamentally wrong. I am not paying her to emotionally abuse my kid." Click, click, click. Each cancellation felt like cutting a cord that had been wrapped around all our necks, slowly strangling us while we pretended we could still breathe normally. I did not try to stop him. I did not argue or urge caution. I simply stood there and watched my husband finally choose his children over his abuser, and I felt something that might have been hope beginning to unfurl in my chest. Then his phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a name that made my stomach perform an unpleasant flip. Diane. Eric stared at the phone for a long moment, his jaw clenching and unclenching. Then he picked it up and, in a move that shocked me, hit the speaker button so I could hear everything. "What did you do?" Diane's voice shrieked through the speaker before Eric could even say hello. There was no greeting, no preamble, no attempt at civility. "My card just got declined at the store checkout. Are you deliberately trying to embarrass me in public?" "I stopped paying your bills," Eric said calmly, his voice remarkably steady, considering the screaming coming through the phone. "That's what I did." I could almost hear Diane's sharp intake of breath through the speaker. "What do you mean you stopped?" she demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that probably made dogs in neighboring counties uncomfortable. "You can't just stop, not after everything I've done for you. You're really going to do this to your own mother because your precious, overly sensitive little girl got her feelings hurt." I pressed my lips together so hard they began to hurt, physically restraining myself from grabbing the phone and saying things I would definitely not regret. "She was proud, Mom," Eric said, and I noticed that his hands had curled into fists on the desk. "Ella was proud of something she worked hard to achieve, and you tore it into pieces and threw it in the trash in front of everyone." "She needed a lesson," Diane snapped back, without a moment's hesitation. "She struts around like she thinks she's better than Bella, and she is absolutely not. Someone has to keep her in check and teach her some humility." My stomach dropped sickeningly. There it was, stated out loud with complete clarity and no attempt at disguise. No more coded language, no more plausible deniability, just the raw, ugly truth. Eric's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a low, deadly calm that was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. "You don't get to hurt my daughter to protect someone else's feelings," he said with absolute finality. "That's not your role, and I will not fund it anymore." "You're letting Megan turn you against your own blood," Diane screamed, and I could hear genuine panic beginning to creep into her voice as she realized he was serious. "You're choosing them over me." "Yes," Eric said simply, "I am." Then he did something I genuinely would not have believed if I had not witnessed it with my own eyes. He ended the call. He hung up on his mother mid-sentence, cutting off her screaming with one decisive press of his thumb. For a moment, we both just stood there in stunned silence, staring at the phone as though it were a grenade that might still explode, even though the pin had already been pulled. I barely had time to process what had just happened before the phone buzzed again, dancing across the desk surface with the force of the vibration. Eric glanced at the screen with an expression of weary resignation. "Melissa," he said, already sounding exhausted. He answered the call and set the phone back on the desk on speaker, apparently committed now to this path of brutal honesty. "What did you do to Mom?" Melissa's voice snapped through the speaker before Eric could speak. "She's crying hysterically. You actually cut her off financially? Over what exactly? Because Ella couldn't handle being told no for once in her life?" "Ella wasn't told no," Eric said, and I could hear the dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "Mom tore up her achievement certificate. She deliberately humiliated an 8-year-old child." "Oh, please," Melissa groaned dramatically, and I could practically see her rolling her eyes through the phone. "It's not that serious. Let's be honest here. Your kid embarrasses Bella constantly with that whole trophy child performance. Ella needed to learn that she's not the star of this family, and someone had to teach her." I felt my heart literally stop beating for a second. I heard my own voice emerge barely above a whisper, speaking before I had consciously decided to say anything. Did she actually just say that? Eric's hand tightened into a fist so rigid his knuckles went white. "So you're admitting it," he said, his voice shaking now but not with fear. "You're actually openly admitting that you think Ella should make herself smaller so that your kid doesn't have to feel insecure about her own abilities?" "Well, yeah," Melissa shot back without any hesitation or shame. It's not fair when she acts superior to everyone else. You let her show off constantly, and then Mom gets blamed for trying to maintain some kind of balance in this family. There it was. No disguises, no sugarcoating, no polite euphemisms, just raw, ugly truth spoken plainly for the first time. Eric's entire body was trembling now, but his voice remained steady and clear. "If you ever talk about my daughter like that again," he said with absolute finality, "we're done. Completely done." "You're throwing away your entire family," Melissa screamed, and now she sounded genuinely panicked as well. "I'm protecting mine," Eric said simply, and then he hung up on her too. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in that small office was both of us breathing, like we had just completed a marathon through fire. Down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of the movie still playing, someone's cartoon voice delivering lines that were supposed to be funny but sounded hollow and distant. Then I noticed movement in the doorway and realized that Hannah was standing there, arms wrapped tightly around herself in a self-protective gesture. She had clearly heard enough of both conversations to understand what was happening. "Are we ever going back there?" she asked quietly, her voice small but steady. Eric looked at her, really truly looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years, instead of seeing her through the distorted lens that Diane had placed over his perception. "No," he said firmly. "Not after this." Hannah nodded once, a single decisive movement like a judge's gavel coming down to deliver a final verdict. Ella appeared behind her sister then, her eyes still puffy and red from crying, still clutching the taped-together scraps of her destroyed certificate in her small hands. "Why doesn't Grandma like when I do good things?" she asked. And that single heartbreaking question hurt more than anything Diane had actually said or done. I crouched down in front of my youngest daughter, taking her free hand gently in mine. "Baby," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "Some people feel very small inside themselves, and instead of doing the hard work to grow bigger, they try to hurt other people who shine brightly. They try to dim other people's light so they don't feel so small by comparison. That's not your fault. You did absolutely nothing wrong. You are allowed to be proud of yourself and your accomplishments." Eric knelt beside me, tears finally spilling over and running down his face unchecked. He gathered both girls into his arms like he was clinging to a life raft in a storm. "No one is ever going to tear up your achievements again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not while I'm here. I promise you both." And for the first time that entire horrible day, I actually believed him. What I did not know yet, what none of us could have predicted, was that the ripple effect from those 2 phone calls was about to hit Diane harder than she had ever imagined possible, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. If I had genuinely believed that the Christmas meltdown and the 2 explosive phone calls represented the end of this nightmare, I was displaying a level of naivete that was almost impressive in its optimism. I was operating under the mistaken assumption that reasonable humans might take a moment to reflect after being confronted with their own cruelty. Diane was not a reasonable human, and she was absolutely not finished. 2 days after we cut off her financial support, I woke up to 9 separate messages from relatives I barely communicate with under normal circumstances. The messages all carried the same basic theme with slight variations. "Have you seen what your mother-in-law posted? Are you okay? Wow." Nothing good has ever begun with the phrase, "Have you seen what she posted?" That particular combination of words is universally recognized as the herald of incoming social media disaster. I opened Facebook with a sense of impending doom, and sure enough, there she was. Diane had composed a full-blown manifesto that was long enough to qualify as a college admission essay, complete with carefully staged photographs. She had positioned herself beside her elaborately decorated Christmas tree, managing to look like she was auditioning for the role of patron saint of suffering mothers everywhere. According to Diane's carefully crafted narrative, I was raising arrogant, entitled children who believed trophies and certificates made them inherently better than family members. In her version of events, Ella had shoved her certificate in everyone's faces with aggressive insistence on being the center of attention. And my personal favorite revisionist detail, Diane had merely gently corrected this inappropriate behavior, which had somehow triggered an explosive overreaction that was entirely orchestrated by Megan. I actually snorted out loud reading this fictional account. Ella could not aggressively shove anything in anyone's face if you offered her a warehouse full of unicorn stickers as incentive. The child is naturally gentle and cautious in social situations. In Diane's retelling, there was absolutely no mention of torn paper, no acknowledgement of trash cans, no reference to the fact that her gentle correction had actually been a deliberate and public humiliation designed to crush an 8-year-old spirit. Then Melissa entered the battlefield like she was Diane's personal hype woman and social media reinforcement. She commented under Diane's post with enthusiastic support. Ella always acts superior to everyone. Some kids genuinely need to be humbled before they become unbearable. Mom was just teaching her basic manners. I nearly dropped my phone when I read that particular comment. My hands were actually shaking with fury. Some kids need to be humbled. I had to physically restrain myself from typing a response that would have read something like, "Yes, and some adults need to be investigated by Child Protective Services." But here we are. Melissa was not finished with her public performance, though. She posted a second comment that somehow managed to be even worse, implying that Bella had been bullied by Ella's constant showing off, and that the family environment had become toxic due to one child being allowed to dominate with her achievements, bullied by an 8-year-old child holding a spelling bee certificate. I sat down on the edge of my bed, feeling physically dizzy with a mixture of pure rage, profound disbelief, and that particular horrible secondhand embarrassment that you experience when someone publicly humiliates themselves with complete confidence that they are actually presenting well. Eric entered the bedroom, his hair still disheveled from sleep. He took one look at my face and immediately knew something had happened. "You saw it?" he asked quietly. "Oh, I saw it," I confirmed. I also witnessed Melissa auditioning for the role of Worst Human of the Year. He took my phone from my hands, read through everything in heavy silence, his jaw progressively tightening with each passing line. His eyes grew harder, his expression darker. Finally, he handed the phone back to me like it was contaminated with something toxic. "We're responding," he said flatly. My stomach performed an uncomfortable flip. I was not entirely certain if what I felt was fear or adrenaline or some complicated mixture of both. "Are you absolutely sure?" I asked hesitantly. "I mean, they're already making themselves look foolish publicly. Maybe we should just let them continue digging their own hole." "They're lying about our child," Eric said with absolute conviction. "They're publicly creating a false narrative that paints Ella as some kind of arrogant bully. We're done letting them control the story." I nodded slowly. He was right, and I knew it. As much as I hated the idea of airing family dysfunction publicly, allowing their lies to stand unchallenged would be worse. We sat together on that same couch where Ella had cried 2 nights earlier, and together we carefully composed a response. It was deliberately short, relentlessly calm, and strictly factual, the complete opposite of Diane's lengthy, emotional tantrum. 2 days ago, our 8-year-old daughter showed her grandmother a spelling bee certificate she was proud of earning. Her grandmother tore it into pieces and threw it in the trash in front of our entire family. This was not the first time she has dismissed, mocked, or actively undermined our children's achievements. We are choosing to step back from that side of the family to protect our daughters. We attached two things to this post: a photograph of Ella's certificate carefully taped back together, and screenshots of text messages from Diane that we had saved over the months. Messages that said things like, "You need to knock her down a peg. Don't let her steal attention from Bella. She needs to stay humble for everyone's sake." We did not add dramatic commentary. We did not accuse anyone of being monsters or demand apologies. We simply presented the objective truth and let it speak for itself. And the truth, as it turned out, spoke very loudly indeed. Comments began pouring in almost immediately, like someone had opened a floodgate. The response was overwhelming. Wait, she actually tore it up? Who does that to a child? I thought Ella was bragging based on the first post. I feel awful for believing that now. This is incredibly toxic behavior. Someone I did not even personally know wrote, "I'm so sorry this happened to your daughter. My grandfather used to do something similar to me when I achieved things. It stays with you for life." Then came a comment that changed the entire dynamic. It was from one of Eric's cousins, someone who had always maintained careful neutrality in family conflicts and never publicly chose sides. "She did the exact same thing to me when I won an award in high school. I never forgot it. I'm glad someone finally said something publicly." Suddenly, the entire comment section transformed. People began deleting their earlier supportive comments on Diane's post. Others started asking Melissa directly if she was genuinely proud of defending a grown woman who had torn up a child's certificate. Someone asked pointedly whether this was the kind of family values they wanted to be known for publicly. Melissa did not respond to any of these challenges. She did not post anything further. Her social media presence went completely silent for the remainder of the day and beyond. Diane similarly went quiet, which was honestly more terrifying than her usual loud dramatics. It was the ominous quiet before a significant storm, the held breath before an explosion, the calm that makes you check your locks and look over your shoulder. But instead of Diane mounting another attack, something entirely unexpected happened. The phone rang, and when Eric checked the caller ID, his eyes widened with genuine surprise. It was Richard, Eric's uncle, the family member who barely speaks during gatherings, rarely attends events, and possesses the emotional expressiveness of a stone statue guarding a bank lobby. If Richard was calling, something significant was happening. Eric answered and immediately put the phone on speaker so I could hear. "I saw both posts," Richard said without preamble, his voice characteristically calm and steady in a way that was somehow unsettling. "And I've spoken with several other family members." "Oh," Eric said, clearly uncertain how to respond. "Okay. This pattern of behavior has continued long enough," Richard continued, with the tone of someone delivering a business verdict rather than discussing family drama. "Your mother has been receiving financial support from multiple family members for years now, and I believe we've all enabled behavior that has become increasingly harmful." My jaw dropped open slightly. Multiple family members, we had not known that. "She's not getting another dollar from me," Richard stated flatly. "Not from you, and not from anyone else she's been leaning on financially." Before either of us could fully process those words, before we could formulate any kind of response, Richard dropped a bomb that left us both speechless. "I've already redirected the money I was sending her every month," he said matter-of-factly. "I've established 2 educational funds, one for Ella and one for Hannah. They'll each have a substantial start for college or whatever educational programs they choose to pursue. It's already done." I had to physically sit down. My legs were not prepared for surprise billionaire uncle energy, even though Richard was not technically a billionaire as far as I knew. "Richard," Eric breathed, clearly as stunned as I was. That's an enormous amount." "That's called accountability and appropriate priorities," Richard corrected calmly. "I would rather invest in children who work hard and value their achievements than continue funding someone who literally tears up their accomplishments." And just like that, as abruptly as he had delivered this news, Richard ended the call. Eric and I stared at each other in absolute stunned silence for a long moment. Then Eric released a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for approximately a decade. Diane discovered what Richard had done with remarkable speed. She immediately started calling every family member she could reach, her voice reportedly reaching decibels that could shatter glass, shrieking that I had stolen her future, that Eric had abandoned his own mother, and that Richard had lost his mind. This time, something fundamental had shifted. Not one single person defended her behavior. Not one family member stepped forward to make excuses or suggest we should all just get along for the sake of peace. Melissa deactivated her entire Facebook account rather than face the ongoing criticism in her comment sections. Raymond reportedly told someone that he was too old for this level of nonsense and wanted no part of the continuing drama. And Diane herself went quiet once again. Not the peaceful quiet of reflection or acceptance, but the dangerous storm-brewing quiet that makes you check your doors and windows. But here's the thing. I did not care anymore. The fear that had kept me silent for years, the anxiety about causing family rifts, the guilt about not keeping peace, all of it had evaporated. That same evening, Ella carefully hung a new copy of her spelling bee certificate on her bedroom wall. This one was not taped together or torn. This one was pristine and whole. She did not ask for permission or wait for approval that was never going to come. She simply claimed her right to be proud of herself. Hannah stood beside her sister and said with quiet conviction, "See, this is how it's supposed to be." Eric stood in the doorway of their room with tears in his eyes. But this time, they were not tears of shame or regret. They were tears of something that looked remarkably like pride. I stood there watching my family reclaim something that had been systematically stolen from them for years. And I felt something strange and unfamiliar settle deep in my chest. It was not victory, because this was not a competition. It was not relief, because the situation still carried grief. It was something steadier and more permanent than either of those emotions. It was a boundary. It was a line drawn. It was a door firmly closed. It was a destructive cycle finally broken. Deanne had tried to make my daughter smaller to protect her own ego and maintain her control over family dynamics. All she had actually accomplished was showing us exactly how tall we could stand when we stopped allowing her to keep us bent and diminished. We had spent years tiptoeing around her cruelty, making excuses, absorbing abuse, teaching our children to hide their light so they would not upset the family balance. And in one explosive Christmas evening, that entire toxic system had finally collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. So now I turn to you, the person who has listened to this entire story unfold. What do you think about everything that happened? Did we go too far in our response? Or perhaps not far enough? Should we have handled the situation differently? Should we have continued trying to maintain family relationships despite the ongoing harm? Or was cutting ties completely the only healthy option available to us? I genuinely want to know your perspective. Have you experienced similar family dynamics where achievements are treated as threats? Have you had to make the difficult choice between maintaining family connections and protecting your children from toxic behavior? These are not rhetorical questions. I am asking because family situations like this one are rarely simple or clear-cut. And sometimes, hearing other perspectives helps us understand our own choices better. Looking back now with some distance from the immediate crisis, I can identify several truths that emerged from this painful experience. First, patterns of abuse do not appear suddenly. They are built gradually over years, normalized incrementally until behavior that should be shocking becomes just how things are in a family. Diane did not wake up one Christmas morning and decide to be cruel. She had been systematically undermining certain family members for years, while we all made excuses and looked away. Second, financial entanglement can be a powerful tool of control and manipulation. The money Eric sent his mother was not just financial support. It was leverage she used to maintain her position of power in the family hierarchy. Cutting off that financial flow was not just about money, it was about severing a chain of control. Third, children see family dysfunction far more clearly than adults often realize. Hannah knew exactly what was happening, long before I was willing to fully acknowledge it. She'd already started protecting herself by hiding her achievements. Our children should never have to develop those kinds of defensive strategies within their own family. Fourth, breaking generational cycles of abuse requires someone to finally say, enough, and accept the consequences of that decision. Eric was repeating his own childhood experiences through his daughters until the moment he chose to break that pattern. It was not easy, and it came with significant costs, but it was necessary. Fifth, public accountability sometimes becomes necessary when private conversations fail repeatedly. We did not want to air family problems publicly, but Diane's public lies about our daughter forced us to present the truth. Sunshine really is the best disinfectant. I will not pretend this situation did not come with costs. We lost relationships with extended family members. Holiday gatherings will be permanently changed. There is grief in acknowledging that the grandmother relationship we hoped our daughters would have is never going to exist. But we also gained something invaluable. Our daughters are learning that they are allowed to shine, that their achievements are worthy of celebration, that they do not need to diminish themselves to make others comfortable. They are learning that people who truly love them will celebrate their growth rather than punish it. They are learning that boundaries are not cruel. They are necessary and healthy. They are watching their parents choose their well-being over family pressure and social expectations. Those are lessons that will serve them throughout their entire lives. If you are reading this and recognizing your own family dynamics in this story, please know that you are not alone. Toxic family systems are more common than people realize, and the pressure to maintain relationships regardless of harm is intense. You do not owe anyone access to your children at the cost of your children's well-being. You are not required to maintain relationships with people who deliberately hurt those you are responsible for protecting. Choosing your children over toxic family members is not selfish. It is exactly what good parenting looks like. If you are in a situation where family members consistently undermine, dismiss, or mock your children's achievements or worth, you have permission to establish boundaries. You have permission to limit or end contact. You have permission to prioritize your children's emotional health over adult feelings. It will be hard. People will criticize your choices. They will accuse you of being dramatic, oversensitive, unforgiving, or family-destroying. But your job is not to keep everyone comfortable. Your job is to protect and nurture the children in your care. Ella's spelling bee certificate now hangs proudly on her wall, whole and uncreased. When she looks at it, she sees evidence of her hard work and capability. She does not see something shameful that needs to be hidden. Hannah has started sharing her achievements again, cautiously testing whether it is safe to be proud of herself. She is slowly unlearning the protective diminishment she had adopted. Eric is working through complex feelings about his childhood and his mother, processing decades of harm that he had internalized as normal. It is not easy work, but it is necessary work. And I am learning that protecting my children sometimes means being willing to be seen as the villain by people whose opinions should not matter more than my daughter's well-being. We did not choose this conflict. We did not want this outcome. But we are learning to live with the consequences of finally choosing our children over dysfunction. And that feels like the right choice, even when it is a painful one. So I ask again, what do you think? Share your thoughts, your experiences, your perspectives in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more honest conversations about the complicated realities of family, boundaries, and choosing health over harmful traditions. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for witnessing what we went through, and thank you for being part of a community that believes children deserve to shine without being punished for it.